Great, thanks so much. Welcome to you all. It's so exciting for us at Mass Insight to have folks from all over the country, as well as our own partner school teachers who a warm welcome and a lot of love from us for you to be here tonight. Tim has been working with Mass Insight now for a long time. We are an AP STEM and English program based in Boston, Massachusetts, and work with many schools in Massachusetts, some in Connecticut and Rhode Island. My contact information is up if anyone is interested in learning more about our support program. We'd love to help out. We do have an APSI that is virtual again this year, our second virtual APSI. We're affiliated with Bridgewater State College. There are grad credits available. The registration link is on this great graphic slide that Tim did for us, featuring Elizabeth Davis, who is working with what we call a fundamentals course. If you go to the website, it will say AP Lang for all teachers. Our other really close friends and great College Board consultants, John Williamson, Mary Jo Zell, Celine Gomez, and of course, our very own Tim. And we welcome you to register for our virtual APSI. We have a great reputation here in New England, and we would love to have voices from all over the country. So please keep us in mind. I don't want to take any more of Tim and Jay's time. We're anxious to hear what you have to say. And again, thanks to all of you for giving up your time tonight and sharing this with us.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Sally. And once again, thank you so much, Jay, for being willing to join the riffraff like me, because we all know that they're all here to see you anyway. So anyway, what we want to cover today, we just want to cover some basic ways of teaching voice and discussing voice. And really, one of the things that happened is that the topic that Jay and I decided to bring out with you all tonight stemmed from a conversation that he and I had last summer when we were just talking about a textbook and the idea of teaching voice. And honestly, I think that we kind of geeked out for about 15 minutes about like why it's a terrible idea to teach voice. But then we realized that it's something that we want to make sure that our kids kind of have is a voice. So today what we're going to do is we're going to kind of relive elements of that conversation. But then we're going to actually try to say, here's some philosophical conceptualization about voice, and then actually look at ways to do it in our classroom. So anyway, Jay, why don't you tell us about what you do in relation to writing and whatnot, and then I'll explain why I'm actually here, because you're the professional, and that will help kind of start shaping what we're doing.
Well, Tim, thanks for the prompt. My last legitimate jobs, when I actually earned, paychecks and that sort of thing, was as editorial director at various publishing companies, doing magazines mostly, but also books. And I assigned writers to write stories or book-length projects, and I would edit them. And Tim and I had this conversation about voice. I take a rhetorical attitude, which every AP Lang teacher does as well, I'm sure, which is basically it's all about the audience, not about necessarily your particular voice at the time. And this is hard for young people to understand. I get that. But generally, in terms of publishing, your voice depends on your audience. And a professional writer generally has to change her or his voice according to that audience. Now, some people who turn into the Stephen Kings of the world, they have one voice and they can stick to it and make millions of dollars. But for the rest of us mortals, generally, our voice has to change. Now, all that being said, Tim and it wasn't 15 minutes, I think it was half an hour.
Yeah, I think you're right.
It was actually an argument between the two of us, and I kind of think you won. So we will talk about why it's a good idea to establish voice.
There we go. I'm sorry, Jay, what was that last thing? I didn't quite catch that.
After I said you won, is it you want me to repeat that?
I relish in that for a moment because I'm just thinking about how I was thanking you for arguing with me. But
well, so it is. I can see that it is important for a student to think about voice and how to do that within the classroom, and we'll be talking about that, right?
Absolutely. And so basically, the reason why we have Jay and me here why I'm here is because With Jay having the professional writing background and me having the teaching background, what we wanted to do, we wanted to kind of philosophically like lay the foundation for voice discussion. And then I basically was like, okay, I'm going to take that philosophical foundation and actually turn it into lesson plans or lesson activities that we can offer for you all that can be turned into like either little homeworks or even bell ringers that can be associated thematically and rhetorically within your classroom. So Jay's the writer, I'm the teacher here, and that's how we're going to try to balance our conversation as we go through things throughout the rest of the night. But before Jay and I actually start talking about teaching voice and things like that, I'm going to ask that we actually get into the comments here and you all try to answer this question for me. So let's take like a minute to just think about this. Like as teachers, as instructors, what does make it really hard for us to teach voice to kids? And I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to just think about that and toss it in the comments. All right, yeah, first one, they don't hear it. Yeah, voice is so personal. Yep. Can we define or quantify voice? We're actually going to talk about ways to try to give kids ways to do that. Yeah. Conversation as opposed to stylistic choices, oversimplified rubrics. Oh my gosh, who would have thought that would have come out? Yeah, absolutely.
They don't have the confidence. That we should be speaking to.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you could get confidence from developing a voice.
Right. And, especially in the one that's similar that I'm seeing here is that students don't think they sound good enough, which is weird because I don't know about your students, but mine talk all day during class. So they think that they have a voice that deserves to be heard, at least during class. No, that's right. That's absolutely right.
The ones who think they're not good enough are probably your best readers.
Right.
They know how much they suck.
Yeah. Oh, here's a good one too, right? They're just stuck in the basic grammar, like run-ons and fragments and whatnot. And I think, Jay, this is actually where we started our conversation about mechanics and grammar when we began discussing that nature of voice, right? Here's another great insight here, because teachers can't find the voice for them, right? And what a cool idea that we have to kind of get them to find their own voice. We can't find that for them. Good. It's subjective. They're trained to write academically and therefore afraid to take risks. Interesting enough about that academic comment here is that, you can have an academic voice as well, and we could talk about what that kind of looks like as well. So yeah, no, these are great comments here. And I hope that we can actually address a decent amount of them as we talk about things. I'm going to just chime in for me in relation to teaching voice is that a lot of my students, when they first come into me as sophomores, they don't have the mechanics of understanding even the function of an academic essay as opposed to a blog post, as opposed to a text message. And because of that, each one of those is going to kind of bring out a different voice in them. And when I ask kids about a thesis statement or topic sentences, and they're like, what is my topic sentence even supposed to do? What is my thesis even supposed to do? So I have to spend a lot of time building the mechanics of kind of knowing what each part does before I can actually get them to start saying, all right, now make each part your own. But before I talk a little bit more about that, Jay, is there anything you want to kind of add to that here in relation to the struggle of voice without the mechanics behind it?
We're going to be talking about how important reading is to finding a voice. I don't think a teacher should tell the student what his or her voice should be, but maybe direct how to find that.
Yeah. Right. And, for me, one of the things that happens in my classroom is I do offer plenty of sentence stems and templates for my students. And eventually I try to get them past those templates and stems and say, you need the parts, but you could do what you want with it. And I always tell my students, like, if you look at any car, you're going to actually see that a Tesla and a Chevy are going to have similar parts, a motor, wheels, a steering wheel, brakes, and things. But one of them just does it better because one of them internalized it and then did its own thing. And, I often compare teaching voice to my kids, and this is just my philosophy in my classroom is, if I don't have kids that don't know the basics of it, like a scale on for a jazz riff or anything like that, then they're going to have a really hard time trying to freestyle on their own. They have to kind of get to their scales first. So for me, grammar and mechanics are really important, but not for the sake of I want them to write rigidly forever. It's for the sake of I need you to know what the parts do in order to actually begin to break free and then use those parts to create your own voice. But that's kind of like what happens in my classroom for these things. So anyway, Jay, why don't you tell us a little bit about the philosophy here about voice development, the things that we've been talking about for the last few weeks with George and whatnot.
Let me start with George Saunders, just because I'm a total George Saunders fanboy. Sally, I can see you nodding your head. First of all, when you talk about voice, George Saunders, who I argue, and I'm happy to have arguments to the contrary, I think he is the world's greatest living writer. How's that for a claim? And, you know, I've got two books with me right now. One is the book you see before you, which just came out, by the way, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain. This is not for your students, I imagine, but it might be for those of you who are really concerned about developing your own craft and then teaching it. What he does is he takes 7 stories by in translation by Russian authors. It sounds terrible when I describe it, but trust me on this one. And then he kind of teaches each one. And this is based on a course he teaches in Syracuse. Now, let me hold up another book. Tim, I didn't show this to you yet. Fox 8, also by George Saunders. Very, very slim book with big type. It sort of reads as a children's book, which I think it was marketed mistakenly as. It's actually got some tragedy to it. It's told in the voice of a fox. And if you just go on Amazon and you say, you know, search within the book and you look at the two styles, you would not know that this book and this book were written by the same author. Now, when it comes to Saunders himself, what I thought I should do, when should I do the translation thing? Does that come later?
Well, we'll talk. You can talk about it now, absolutely. But I'm going to give them stuff to do in class at the end. So you can talk about it now, yeah.
So one of the things he does at the end of this book is he's got a series of appendices that are exercises. One is a translation exercise, and Tim, I read this to you before. He takes a particular writer, a Russian writer, Isaac Babel, and he comes up with 5 versions, all legitimate by different translators. And let me read you these sentences. They're very short, trust me. In verdure hidden walks, wicker chairs gleamed whitely. That's one translation. Wicker chairs, gleaming white, lined paths overhung with foliage. Another one. White wicker chairs glittered in walks covered with foliage. Another one. Translation of the same sentence. Wicker armchairs dazzled white along green shrouded promenades. And finally, in leafy avenues, white wicker chairs gleamed. Now, he takes that and he translates it as white wicker chairs gleamed in the green. And he says, what green are you talking about? So he writes, white wicker chairs tucked into a foliage-thick promenade gleamed. Not quite. And he goes on until finally he goes, 3 white wicker chairs looked out into the houseplant jungle surrounding them as if contemplating escape. Now, what he's doing there is to show he is absolutely showing voice. And what he's saying is you need to take your own sentences as you write them the first time. That first draft is not your voice. Your voice comes when you're translating yourself, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Stephen King's On Writing, if you haven't read it yet, is much more of a great primer on how to write and can be very inspiring especially for young people who are really interested in writing someday and disappointing their parents with their income. Back to you, Tim.
Yeah. So one of the things that, developing voice highly relates upon is the idea of making choices. And a lot of times I think that as teachers, and myself included, I want to give my kids the scaffolded supports so that they can learn the mechanics that are meant for even an academic essay, right? And we're going to talk about trying to consider changing that into more authentic experiences today as well. But we really, the idea of voice stems from this idea of making choices that are meaningful. And most of my students, especially at the beginning when I teach writing, are thinking, am I making a choice that Freitas will approve of, right? In relation to what he's offering me for scaffolds. And I don't mind that at the beginning, but eventually I try to get my kids to recognize this idea of, I don't want you to make a choice because you're thinking about me. I want you to make a choice because you're thinking about your argument and what's going to actually make it more persuasive, right? And so what I've done here just on this slide is I've given the kind of, priming choice questions for kids to get them to start considering voice. And then I highlighted in blue the one that I think is the most important, that kids don't necessarily think about a lot. Okay. And so the first one is, who is my audience? So notice that we're going to get right into the rhetoric of choice right here. And the rhetoric of choice becomes the rhetoric of voice, right? And so they have to think about who their audience is.
Yeah.
Then, just please, if you're in here, just check to see if you're on mute. I thought I clicked to mute people upon entrance, but apparently I did not. So if you could just check to make sure that you're muted. You can unmute and ask a question if you want. That's perfectly fine with me. But if you're just kind of unmuted, just check on that, please. But anyway, so what I did here was I put out these foundational choices that kids can start making to start thinking about developing their voice, because they're pretty low risk for the most part, and they do things that they already study in their classroom, right? So who's my audience? What are their characteristics? This is very AP-ish, of course, right? And then we have, what do I want my audience to understand and do? And this works for lit too, right? If kids are writing, their own short story or their own poem, they can still think about the purpose of their writing and the message they want to convey. But really, if you look at this blue question here, this is going to help us. Oh, Stephanie, it's no problem. You're forgiven, I promise. But anyway, this blue question here, I think, is really going to start getting kids to consider what it means to start developing their own voice in relation to the circumstance of their writing. And it's, how do I want the audience to perceive me? That's going to be really indicative of the choices that they make. Do they want the audience to perceive them as being, really forthright in what they're doing? Do they want them to seem passive? Things of that nature. How aggressive do we want to be? How empathetic do we want to, be perceived? Things like that. And so this is a really key question that I think that if we get kids thinking about that at first, that's going to already start pushing them to make different choices. And then underneath it, we have, how do I want to convey my message? And then what methods will make this most clear to my audience? So this is kind of a collective experience, but if we're talking about fiction or nonfiction, this is going to help kids as they write, no matter what, as they begin to establish their voice. So that's kind of it foundationally for that. So I'm going to just switch my slide here, and Jay, why don't you take over from here as we consider this more philosophically, and then we'll get into what can we do in our classroom.
Well, I spoke earlier in talking about George Saunders. I follow what he believes, which is your voice doesn't come in the first draft. It really comes from two sources. It comes from what you read and the taste you develop from that reading. And by taste, I don't necessarily mean good taste versus bad taste. It's what you like and what you don't like, what you think is good and what you think isn't. And one of the things that really important that I train writers with all the time is to make sure that they're looking at every sentence to see what they like or dislike about it. And so you have kind of an on-off switch. Do you like that sentence? Okay. Does the sentence lead to the next sentence? Does it make the reader want to read the very next thing, sentence after sentence, paragraph after paragraph? And then, if it's not, what is it that could make that sentence better every time? Now, that's when the voice comes out, because it comes out of your own taste. So your voice comes from your taste. Your taste really has to come from reading. It's not just going to come from reading yourself, or you're never going to get out of your own head.
Right. And that's actually, a really strong point there, because if kids aren't reading, right, then they aren't going to know what they're actually drawn to in terms of what to emulate, or what they kind of want to pick and what they don't want to pick. And I do have exercises that will show up in a couple slides that can help us with that. in our classroom. But, it's funny because I think that a lot of times, my kids, when I was a new teacher, I used to assign writing. I didn't teach writing. And when I would assign writing, I'd say, okay, you have to have this done for tomorrow or for 2 days from now. But now I actually, in my classroom, like developing voice is going to take time because we have to go back and get the rewriting to come in. Is this sentence I wrote really great? And I love that the question that we kind of came up with to ask after that, why not? Because it implies that it's not great the first time. It can't be great the first time, right? And today I was even just rewriting things with my students, and I kept on asking them, what needs to change in this sentence? Why is it not great? And they were like, every sentence, Freitas, every sentence. And I'm like, yes, every sentence. But notice that takes time, right? And as teachers, a lot of times we don't feel like we have time. So we have to try to say, okay, how can we allow for this amount of time? And, it's hard enough teaching in a hybrid setting anyway, or fully online. And now it's like, okay, how do we have more time to kind of do this? But if we want to really develop this success, we really got to encourage kids to rewrite and ask this question: is it truly great? And if I don't think so, why not? Because then they can pinpoint what they need to do to fix it. And you could offer suggestions as teachers as well. But like I said, this is the kind of philosophical movement behind this, and I will give you some steps for how to do this. All right, I'm going to switch my slide here. So, Jay, before I get into we can do in our classroom, why don't you tell us about one of the ways that you worked with your daughter on this, and then we're going to turn it into how can we start putting this in our classroom and applying such things.
So I got a job back in the day in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the school system really wasn't up to snuff by our standards, and so we decided to homeschool the kids for a couple of years. And my daughter was entering ninth grade when we got there, and my job was to teach the humanities to her at 7 o'clock in the morning. You can just imagine. So one of the exercises we did, because I wanted her to get very deeply thoughtful about not just her writing, but her reading as well. So I had her read a bunch of short stories and then choose her favorite one. And she chose a short story by Edgar Allan Poe. She still has a macabre kind of sense, and she's 35 years old. So what I had her do was to reread that story several times. Then I had her type it, transcribe it, word for word while she's looking at the thing. Then I had her read her transcription, then toss all of that aside and try to write the short story herself. And then compare the two. What did she not notice? What did she like about what she had added to the story? And what did she like about what she had missed in Poe? It was a way to get into the details and the technical aspects of the writing without my having actually to sort of teach it to her. And she actually thought it was a useful exercise, and despite her snarky attitude on every other subject, actually said that she liked it.
Now,
we're going to do it more simply, right?
Yeah, we certainly are. But what's the term for that? Because as for many of us that are AP Lang teachers, I know there might be some lit teachers in here as well. But for many of us who are AP Lang teachers, what's our Greek term for that?
Prosopopoeia.
Right. Notice that you're not going to see that word in this
Yeah.
at all. Because
Don't ask me to spell it.
I was hoping that you'd be the one that would do it, because it ain't going to be me. That's for sure.
Well, the point of prosopopoeia, which was done in ancient Greece and Rome, was to adapt the voice and try to channel the voice of someone else. And it was a way to get out of your own head into other people's heads. And it was often used as an oratorical exercise. So I thought it would be really good if she tried to channel this writer she likes so much, which basically every professional writer has spent years and years and years channeling the last writer they loved. Their voice changes and changes and changes until they get a style that they're kind of used to.
Right. And so, when we were talking about this, and we were talking about, how this relates to our classrooms, and the idea of looking at voice, and we decided that, this fits so well in AP Lang and AP Lit, and even just Lit studies and rhetorical studies, because as we go through this process, and I'll go through a simplified process in a few minutes, it's going to allow kids to also identify techniques like literary and rhetorical techniques. So they're going to get their practice doing that while they're looking for things that might be their flavor, while we can also provide them with authentic writing experiences to practice elements of voice as well. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to give kids tools for their toolbox. And there are a couple ways that we can do this. So I'm going to go through some steps here. Like I said, this slideshow will actually be available when it gets mailed out, and I'll post it in the comments too. I'll post the link for it, right? But so we've got our steps here, and the first step that I want to encourage you to think about doing with your kids in your classroom, this can be like bell ringer stuff. For most of us as teachers, we have, even if we have a unit, let's say we're doing a unit on civil disobedience or we're doing a unit on technology, most of us have some sort of core mentor text, right? Now, what I'm about to suggest isn't going to sound way fun, but it's going to get kids to read and reread and then apply it to their writing. So this is the part that we want to get them thinking about, kind of a metacognitive approach to their reading and their writing. So what I would suggest is that you take a mentor text or the mentor text for your unit, that first one that you use, and then pick out a selection that you potentially find rich, or ask your kids to pick out a section that they find particularly enriching. So you can kind of say, here's a nice stylized piece or a part that has some strong voice, or you can ask the kids to do it depending on who's in front of you, right? And, you know, keep it to a smaller section. Jay, you said you had to copy all of the Poe story?
Yeah, it was homeschooling.
Yeah, right. So Jay was all about torture. That's not what we're doing here, right? But a manageable section, right? And have the kids read it because they think that it's worth, that they can either hear that speaker's voice or they actually really like something about it from that kind of anchor text. You can also choose some thematically related texts, and I'll show you how I did that in just a few minutes on other slides. But the first step, pick that out. It's awesome. It's awesome. It's worth reading. And there's something stylistic there. Now, one of the things that we could think about as if we're teaching AP Lit or AP Lang or whatever we're teaching, you can also say, am I focusing on a particular technique? Like I'm doing poetry right now with my AP Lit seniors. So I've been dealing a lot with caesura and enjambment. And I'm like, oh my word, I could pick out a great section with some caesura here that I could get my kids to kind of read and think about, because I want them to mimic that with my final assignment. But I mean, this really isn't that hard. Day one, they come in, you're like, hey, read this section right here. And, oh, thank you for, Jay, we did get a spelling in the comments there.
Was that Layla?
Yes. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Layla.
Anyway, sorry, that was a little distraction on my part. But I can give that to the kids and all they have to do is read it on the first day. So they kind of know a little bell ringer. I have to come in and read this and kind of read it thoroughly here, right? So that's kind of our first step. It's like, hey, read this because there's something nice about it, or there's something that's unique about it. It might not even be nice because a kid might hate it. It might not be the kid's flavor, honestly, right? So then what you could do, they read it on day one. So let's say it's Monday. They read that section and they're like, okay, my teacher made me read this. Well, they come in on day two and you need a bell ringer and actually have them copy it. However, Jay, why don't you comment on that little part down the bottom there that we have? Because you were like, no control C, right?
Right. No actual copy. You've got to type it, transcribe it.
Yeah. You know, and I actually, with my kids, I make them do everything by hand. So for me, it's got to go through the eyes and actually be enacted out the hand as well. In my classroom, I use almost no typing at all. But yeah, copy the rich section of the text, transcribing it in some way, word for word. And the reason why this is important, folks, is because they're not only processing it with the reading on the first day, but they're rereading it the second day, but they're actually also putting it into action. They're copying it themselves. And because of that, they're going through and they're rereading this kind of element. Then, Jay, did you say something?
Nope. You're
Okay.
doing great.
So the next step, right? And you could do this throughout a class period. You could do this as bell ringers. Like I said, it depends on what your flavor is for your classroom. For me, I would actually do it during an entire period, not as bell ringers, just because that's not what I typically do. Or I would do like a couple sections of this a day and then kind of shift things up a little bit because I like to keep my classroom moving. But the next thing that they do is they need to reread the text again. So this is the third time that they've read it, really considering it and then putting it out of sight. And what's going to happen after that is they're going to have to rewrite what they've read from memory. Now think about this. They've reread a small section at least 3 times, and now they are actually going to do some sort of memorization element here. Now, kids might be like, oh, why do I have to do this? Well, first of all, in life, you have to memorize things anyway, right? I tell my students all the time when I make them memorize poems and things like that, they're like, why? I'm like, if you want to be a doctor, you're going to have to memorize medical terminology. You have to do it. And, so they're going to need some expertise there. And when they rewrite it, that's going to bring us to the most important part here, which is what Jay brought up with his daughter. And that is comparing their copy to the original. So if they've memorized, or if they've looked at 4 lines or 5 lines that they thought were moving or engaging, you could choose it for them, or you can have them choose it from the excerpt that you're reading. When they compare, notice the questions that we're asking down here. What's different? Why didn't I notice? What didn't I notice? And why didn't I notice it? Because that's where the style and voice comes in. And that's what we want to drive kids towards, recognizing those elements in their text. Anything to add, Jay, before I continue?
This is not just to make them a better writer, but a better reader as well, obviously.
Yeah. I got a comment that just came in here. Okay. This is a great question from Emily. And Emily, this is nothing that's dogmatic here, right? So there are so many different ways that you can implement this. And I think that you kind of have to address your audience. So Emily basically just asked, right, do we kind of set them up for that memorization element first? I think that for my kids, I would not set them up knowing that they had to memorize this.
Yeah, I sprung it on my daughter.
Yeah, because I think that's when you're going to have to be like thinking much more besides the rote. I guess my example for this would be when I'm in my classroom and I'm giving out handwritten notes and I put them up on the board. I use scaffolding notes a lot. And if kids know that the scaffolding notes are going to be on the board, they don't pay attention to what I'm saying. They just fill in their blanks, right? So I actually choose not to put them on the board until I'm ready for them to actually fill in that blank so that I know that they're thinking about a lot of different elements as opposed to just focusing on getting the words on the page. And so I would suggest that you might not tell them, but if you know that your kids are going to have really high anxiety, then perhaps you would reconsider. So Julie, about the anchor passages, right? For me, my example that I'm going to have, like if I love to use Cesar Chavez as He Showed Us the Way. I love that piece. It was on a past AP exam. I think it's great for teaching so many different things. I actually would take probably a 2-paragraph section that takes up about 6 sentences in total. I think about the part where he contrasts the outcomes of violence with the negative outcomes of violence and the positive outcomes of nonviolence. I'd really want to try to drive kids there as they think about the contrasting choices that he makes as he promotes that kind of ideology for that. And so, yeah, I will show you what this looks like with some passages in just a couple minutes. But I'm just going through the process right now. So hang tight, I guess, would be kind of the way that I would say it. But I would say get the kids to read a whole passage, like an essay, and then maybe even ask them, guys, pick out like a 10 sentence max section, and then we're going to do something fun with it. But make sure it's one that's really meaningful to you, because we do want to try to put the kids in charge, because if we're just selecting things for them and we're trying to get them to develop their own voice, and they're the ones that are supposed to be in charge of their voice, and we're the ones that are still feeding them the passages, then, or like all of the passages they have to follow, then we might be self-defeating here. So it's just something to consider as you do this.
Hey, Tim, one thing that you would know it's too short if you've got a large portion of your class easily memorizing it. I would think it should be just a little beyond memorization ability.
Right. And you know what? I think that's a great way to put it, because that's where we want to teach kids. We want them to, they can reach it. It's just a little bit farther, and that's how we get them to grow. And that small amount of struggle there is where the most growth will come from. And so if we go back to our slides here with our, what's different and what didn't I notice and why, that's going to get them to start recognizing what the author did, what they didn't do. And then you can even ask the kids, what is it that you admire most about what you noticed that you missed? Because now they're seeing the value in what they may have missed. But that question there, what do you admired most about what you missed? Maybe the kid thought that he or she did something better or conveyed something differently and was like, oh, my different portrayal of this, I think sounds cool. So this is not like a, oh, hey, you did something wrong. This is a, what did you admire that you missed for yourself or for someone else? And if you think about this, think about all of the critical thinking that you're getting your kids to do. And if we do a 6 to 10 sentence kind of passage, that's not a lot, but we're getting a lot out of the kids. We're using a very little amount to get very, very deep. And we could do this over days, like I said, or through a couple class periods to go through these steps. And when kids and say what they admire about what they missed, those are the toolboxes to figure out the flavor that they like. These are the things that I like. I really like that author, I really like that author does A, B, C, or D. Oh, so Ms. Cody, just so you know, I'm going to have you make the example of this piece in a couple minutes. So just be advised here, right? But this is the thing. We want to give kids the opportunity to think what they admire because we're trying to get them to figure out their taste. And then we could say, hey, let's try to do these things. So the next thing, right, and this is the last part where we could start actually projecting voice or getting kids to project voice is this. I'm going to just say, let's say I'm doing this with Cesar Chavez, okay? I'm going to now give my kids a contextually meaningful opportunity to write something like Cesar Chavez. So the kids come in all day and they complain how in the bathrooms it's single ply and not two ply. Fine. That is the social injustice in the classroom for the day. You now get to write to the school board in the style of Cesar Chavez, convincing the school to raise its budget for Charmin or something like that, right? You like giving them, finding out what's going on in their lives, give them an authentic, contextually meaningful situation to emulate the style of that mentor text. And what's cool about that is if you're having a discussion about these things and the kids are trying to emulate that and they're like, I don't like it. Well, then good. You've produced your assignment. You've analyzed choices. You've analyzed the author's style and voice. You've tried it on for yourself. You notice you didn't like it, so don't keep it. It's not your flavor. And so now we've got this really collective approach of analytical reading in conjunction with practical analytical writing. But the key part of slide 7 here is trying to find a way to get it to be contextually engaging for kids. So we know that Cesar Chavez was about, our labor union activists, or if you want to use something like Malala Yousafzai or something like that, let them create their own, push for global educative support. Let them push their, hey, I think we need more funding for this particular sport in the school or this particular activity. Awesome. But do it in the style or in the voice of so-and-so. And as Jay, I think that as you said earlier, as a professional writer, you kind of have to be ready to change your voice. And so we're even preparing kids for that as their careers go forward.
Yeah, I've written in the past 2 years 3 ghost written voices. One in the voice of a 12-year-old female cancer survivor. One in the voice of a former NASA engineer who just started his own company, and one by a pair of bank CEOs. Each one's voice was entirely different. And I'll tell you, it makes my voice better when I write my own stuff because it's that much richer exercising prosopopoeia. So by the way, slide 7 here, Tim, this is true prosopopoeia. When you're not just memorizing someone else's voice, but you're taking on their voice and channeling it into something else.
Right. And I think that that's what's going to make it meaningful for the kids too, as they experience it, right? Because what we do, we learn through experience. And it's funny because a lot of times we don't always let kids get to that full experiential moment. It's like, okay, we'll give you this kind of semblance of experience. Like, let's get them to do it. My argument unit for my AP Lang kids becomes the most real when I force my kids to actually write a letter to the editor. And they have to go through a lot of different thoughts. And the other thing too, and this is, something I tell my kids all the time, you're going to have so many different professors in college that that really want different things when you write. You need to learn what their flavor is, and you're going to have to change things up a bit. And I'm like, so if anything, if you can write like Cesar Chavez, right, or try to adopt his voice, or Malala Yousafzai or whatever, right, it's good practice for learning how to write for your professor in college.
Hey, Tim, have you seen Meg's comment there? This would be interesting.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, Meg, listen, if you want to develop that unit and then come on the Garden of English, I'm happy to do a video with you where you can present that and we will get that out to the world, because
And
that's,
if I can help, let me know.
yeah. I think that would be really, really fun. Really fun. So that's where all this comes in. So so those are just steps that you can enact in your classroom in some way, but I want to also talk about a couple other things that you can consider doing. Especially, is there anybody in here who teaches IB? Any IB teachers in there? If so, toss it in the chat there, just to see if there is someone. No, that's okay. Here's the deal, right? I know that with IB, they have to teach one work in translation, but I'm also willing to bet that most of us teach at least one work that's been in translation. And this kind of goes back to what Jay was talking about earlier. But if we look at works in translation that have been translated into English, we can easily apply a very similar element. And if we do, you're going to notice that I've got this right here. We're asking this question: what's your flavor? What's your flavor as a reader to become a writer? So I think that somebody recently, a couple comments back, was like, hey, looking forward to an example of this admire step. Okay. But if you look at this slide right up here, these are 3 different translations of the Odyssey. And Emily Wilson's, I think, was 2017. She was the first woman to translate the Odyssey into English. And so we've got the first section here. I think this is a perfect amount of text for a kid to kind of practice this with. But if we do this with works in translation, now we have, look at how 3 different people translated this. And now we want to ask the kids, which one do you like the best? And why? Why do you like that one the best? So you know what? I'm going to ask that we take a minute right now. Just read the first couple lines here and toss it in the chat. Which one do you like the best? Do we like the Lattimore? Do we like the Wilson? Do we like the Pope? And why? And why? So take a moment to just read the first, I don't know, 2 or 3 lines and compare them. I'll even put my answer in the chat.
Extra points if you know the original meaning of the word polytropos. I can read that the 3 lines aloud if it's too blurry for you, or you can, Tim.
Oh, all right, yeah, I'll just read the first. Actually, Jay, why don't you do it? Yeah, read the first couple lines for them. That'd be awesome.
Lattimore is tell me, muse, of the man of many ways who has driven, etc. Emily Wilson's tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost, etc. Pope's, I gotta change the screen myself. The man for wisdom's various arts renowned, long exercised in woes, oh muse, etc. And by the way, only one of them is an actual faithful translation of the original Greek. And it'd be interesting to see who knows which one.
Oh my goodness, somebody actually did this exact exercise yesterday.
Wow.
Who would have thought? So which one is it, Jay? What's our actual direct translation?
Lattimore.
All right.
Who is one of the great Greek scholars of all time.
You know,
and
but
the reason being the man of many ways, it's polytropos is such an important term because we in rhetoric we teach tropes, right? Polytrope, and what are tropes? They're turnings. They turn the mind. So polytropos is someone who turns the minds in different directions, or it's one of many wiles or many tricks. And that's why you see these complicated man, you know, long exercised in woes is a part of polytropos as well. I won't go into the weeds here, Tim. I'll shut up.
Well, the point here, though, is this is a great activity for kids. You can do it with any work in translation, but you can also translate this into your own class where it's like, hey, we've got something archaic or something that kids would consider archaic. And can I translate that? Can I update the language, but still try to maintain the richness, right? I mean, we have this Wilson version and it is celebrated as quite beautiful, right? But it's different. And I actually saw people in the comments that were like, you know, the Wilson one, it is actually, you know, it's going to flow easier for my students. I think was one of the comments that I saw, right? And, you know, but why? Why do you like it so much? We can ask kids to do that too. Give us the updated element where we try to keep elements of style, perhaps add our own voice to it, but also kind of translate as well. So if we can compare translations, we can get kids to kind of update it themselves and ask them, what are you trying to keep? What are you trying to change? What are you trying to lose, right? Scarlet Letter would be perfect for something like this. And notice all of the choices that the kids are making. And this is the best way to teach voice because kids kind of think that like in our classes, they want, I guess this is an administrative thing more than anything else, where we have our objectives. Today, kids will learn their own voice, their unique voice, you know, like they could check off a box for voice. And now we're giving kids a million options of how to do it. And that's to me is like the smoke and mirrors of like, I know what I'm doing. I'm trying to prepare you for developing your voice and gaining a new toolbox of techniques, but I'm trying to make it seem almost as easy as possible. Kids are reading this and they're like, I like this one more because it's easier to read. Okay. Well, then what about it makes it easier to read that you actually enjoy? And they have to go back and reconsider and reread and things like that. I'm going to present one more thing in just a second, Jay. Is there anything else you want to comment on about this though?
Only if there's a way to get all wise on your students and let them know that as they get older and they continue to read, they may decide a different translation is a better one. In other words, their taste may change. If there's any way to hint that this isn't something, who they are right now is not going to be determined. A few years from now or when they're in college, they're going to be reading differently and they're going to like things differently.
And so that's going to bring me to my last point here. And that is you could go through this same process as well, but you can do it with comparative texts. Okay. And so I have an example of this about what's your flavor. And what I did was I chose two social issues from very common pieces of nonfiction for AP Lang folks in here. And I chose the Florence Kelly speech that was on a past AP exam. In her speech to the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And I chose Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech here, right? And I just wanted to choose some repetition here of common phrases. If you want to call it an afro, that's fine. But if you're teaching a particular kind of technique in your classroom, or if you're teaching a particular device in your classroom, if you want kids to start thinking about how that could actually help their voice, give them options of things to look at where they can see it in action doing different things. So what I did here was I just chose an excerpt where we see Florence Kelly saying while we sleep as she's, you know, decrying the atrocities of child labor, right? And the repetition here is for guilt. While we sleep, this is going on with our children. While we sleep, this is going on with our children. And so there's an emotional pull from this repetition for guilt. And that's what it emphasizes, because repetition always emphasizes. And then if we look at the, you know, classically studied, you know, I mean, this is like a staple in almost every classroom, the I have a dream speech, right? This repetition here is meant to inspire hope. So we can get kids to think about the same technique actually functioning different ways and then saying, good, if you can actually address that now, what can you do in your writing with repetition? And then you give them that option. Well, not that option. You give them that kind of directive in your classroom. We've been studying this in our kind of, you know, different elements of social justice here. Now let's talk about repetition and put it in your own argument essay and really try to use that. And if kids try to use it and they can explain to you why they made that choice for their audience, notice how engaging this becomes. It's not just I'm putting readings in front of my kids, I'm asking them to analyze it, and then we move on. It's becoming, I'm analyzing it, I'm comparing it, I'm seeing that they do different things, even though they're the same type of repetition. And now how can I do that in my own writing? And that goes back to the authentic contextual experience after. say, hey, here are all the cool things that we looked at in this particular unit. Can you put this in your own argument that you're sending to the principal to get your, to get your better paper towels? You want bounty in there instead of the tree bark that they give you. All right, super cool. Things like that. So there are a bunch of ways that you can bring all this together in your classroom so that you don't have to just say, do I only do this as steps for a bell ringer over a period of 2 weeks? Do I only do this over 2 days? Can I do this throughout my class? And you can do this with poetry too, right? High schoolers are not known for writing the best poetry, but when you teach them about caesura and enjambment and its function, and then you let them try it, you'll be surprised, right? What they'll actually do for their thoughtfulness. And then as they explain their own use of a technique, that makes it easier for when they have to analyze it later on exam day, because they've tried it, they've used it, and you've given them an authentic reason to use it. And those are the kind of things that kind of, make that worthwhile to them. And it doesn't actually make it seem like you're just assigning writing, you're teaching writing. And not only are you teaching it, you're teaching it through engagement. And that's what we're trying to do. And that's engagement with reading as well. So at the end of the day, right, Jay and I, Jay, I'm speaking for you for just a minute, right, are trying to get across this idea that voice is about choices. And the more opportunities we can offer kids to do that, is going to be better for them. So Jay, anything to finalize, sure things up here before we ask for a couple questions?
Only just one detail, and that is the choices that they themselves will be making are in the rewriting. So that's,
Right.
you've got to figure out some way to get them to do that.
Absolutely. I can't echo that enough in our classrooms, right? Rewriting is the hardest part. I actually brought in rewriting this year. I let all my kids rewrite their timed writings if they want to, and I give them the better score if they rewrite it. And consistently, almost every time, they will do much better. And so because of that, that's the way that I do it, but I don't put comments on the rewrite. I tell them, you get comments on the first draft, not the rewrite, but I'll give you a new score on the rewrite. And a lot of my kids will take me up on that. And it takes me like a minute to read the paper, 2 minutes, just because I'm not commenting. But more opportunities for rewriting is so, so important in the classroom. Jay, I'm going to take a couple questions if you're cool with that. Are you cool with that?
I'm cool.
Okay. And Pam, I'll answer your question in just a minute. Just so you know, Jay can be reached at Argue Lab. If you actually go there, he's got awesome resources. I can be reached at thegardenofenglish.com. And I've actually had Jay Skype in with my kids before, like in class, and they love it. And they absolutely adore it. So Jay, I'm marketing you right now to Skype in with those kids because my kids look forward to it. They still talk about it even this year,
And I'm free, whether you adopt my books or not.
Right. So yeah, let's take some questions. Tessa, why don't you unmute and I'll try to address it, or Jay will try to address it as best we can.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Jay. It's Tanya. I know I've got a Tessa Pope, but that's my daughter, and
Yeah.
I can't work out how to change that.
Hi, Tanya.
Hi. So to Tim and Jay, I was sort of interested in the academic voice. I know you said right in the beginning that would maybe something you would address and just talk about in terms when it comes to writing argument, what that academic voice sounds like, and should we even be going there with our kids, or is it more just sort of them finding their own flavor that is important? Yeah.
So Jay, why don't you answer that as a writer, and then I'll answer it as a typical high school teacher.
Oh boy, I don't know, Tanya, if you want to hear from me on this one. My writing deteriorated during my 4 years at an elite college because I was writing in the academic style. I mean, it is a style, and I think what you have to do is to understand that style and be able to adopt a voice. It is useful in your ability to change your own voice. But Tim, you can speak more profoundly to this than I can.
Right. Well, not more profoundly, but I can speak about it in the high school setting, right? I mean, I think that traditionally, let's talk about the AP exam itself first. I think traditionally, most kids are going to go for the academic moment there because that's what most teachers are teaching. And then on exam day, the academic essay is kind of what's expected. But I'll tell you, right, that the best papers I've ever read as a reader have been those papers that have such a rich voice or do something so out of the ordinary that it's like, this is not your typical essay, right? But one of the things about teaching the academic voice too, is that the kids are going to go to college, right? And they are going to be required to write academic essays. But if you give them opportunities like this, where they can have those moments of authentic contextual argument, and you teach them the academic voice, you're also teaching them, you can change how you communicate based on the context. And that's really what we're trying to do. Different contexts require different voices. And for me in my classroom, what I normally do is I try to introduce things in a context that they're familiar with. And then I move to the academic voice for the final paper. And so that they will have actually practiced with both throughout.
Thank you so much. And I know I feel so, I validate exactly what you're saying, Tim, that I want them to have a voice in writing, a voice they understand, and know about themselves, not just for writing, but, when you're applying for a job, when you in an interview, how do you sound? And I mean, I don't mean in how you sound, but that you recognize what that voice is and how that comes across in terms of the way you just express yourself, in all of those details that we talk about in terms of voice.
Yeah. Other questions, comments, or fashion tips?
By the way, thanks, Tanya, for all the help you've given me on AP Lang.
Oh yeah, for sure, Jay. Great hearing from you again.
Ditto.
I do have a question in the chat here, which is, I did mention how I let my kids rewrite their timed writings. I do make them stay after school for that. So I tell them if they're going to do it, it has to be during a study hall or after school, but I'm happy to let them do it. Fitting it in it's based on their schedule, but I also spend a lot of time after school, doing different things for the Garden of English or grading, because I'm an English teacher and it's like a Sisyphusian task. But, because I'm typically there, that's when the kids, I'll give them another, 40, 50 minutes after school to kind of get their stuff together. Any other questions? I'm trying to go through the chat here just to. Jay, Sally says we need to come back. What do you say? We come back sometime? All right, Sally. I think that we can work that out. That's up to Jay though. He's the director. He's the director next time.
Oh
right.
No, man, you do a brilliant job. You're the boss all the time, Tim.
All right. Well, anyway, I hope that you all have a great one. Oh, you know what? Before you leave, why don't I actually put the website? I mean, put the link to the file. Oh my gosh, I can talk. To the slides in the chat. That link should work. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your support. And I really appreciate you coming out tonight. And as always, Jay, a huge thank you to you. Oh my gosh, it's like a dream come true.
Thanks for inviting me, Tim. This is so much fun, and I honor what teachers do. You guys are so important to our country, more than ever. And I'll do anything for you. I really mean it.
All right, we're gonna stop sharing that screen. Jay, hope you didn't turn into a pumpkin.
It is close to my bedtime.
Yeah, you're feeling okay, right?
Yeah, so far.
Awesome.